Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly historic moment, King Charles III's April 2026 state visit to the United States. And we're not just going to look at this as your standard royal tour. We're breaking this down as an absolute masterclass in strategic diplomacy and the precise mechanics of soft power.
Think about it for a second. When politicians completely burn bridges, who exactly do you send in to fix them? It's a really serious question, because before this visit even kicked off, the geopolitical tension was just immense. The US and the UK were caught in this severe, highly public rift over the US-Israeli war with Iran. Prime Minister Keir Starmer and President Trump were fundamentally at odds. Relations had essentially hit rock bottom. So how do you even begin to repair that level of diplomatic damage? Okay, let's dive into this. The situation basically required something totally outside the normal boundaries of standard politics. It actually needed a 1,000-year-old institution to step in. Just picture the dramatic contrast here. You have a British king, representing this ancient, inherited monarchy, walking right into the most divided, modern legislature in the world. And his goal? To mend a critical international relationship that elected officials literally couldn't fix themselves at that specific moment.
To put that into perspective, this kind of thing almost never happens. King Charles is literally only the third reigning British monarch to ever set foot on American soil. You had King George VI back in 1939, and then Queen Elizabeth II. And it gets even more striking, because Charles is only the second British monarch in history to ever deliver an address to Congress. So the sheer historical weight of this whole event was already established before he even opened his mouth.
Section 1, the masterclass in Congress. A bipartisan moment. On April 28th, right after a morning meeting in the Oval Office, the king addressed a joint meeting of Congress. Now, we all know recent State of the Union addresses in that exact same room have been, well, heavily fractured. Lots of empty seats, disruptions, walkouts. But for the king, the members of both chambers were absolutely rapt. They gave him repeated bipartisan standing ovations.
So what did he actually say to unite the room like that? Well, his speech basically rested on four core pillars. First, NATO and collective defense. Despite some recent public critiques of NATO from the president, Charles championed the alliance, saying those mutual defense ties are hardwired together. Second, Ukraine. He explicitly advocated for continued U.S. support, which is a highly sensitive issue, but miraculously, it drew a bipartisan standing ovation. Third, he warned against isolationism and the danger of going it alone. And finally, he wrapped all of this up in a powerful call to action based on shared history, spanning all the way from the Magna Carta to 9/11. He managed to champion these incredibly sensitive issues completely impartially, without directly criticizing a single political figure. Now, what's really interesting about this strategy is that it relies on a brilliant diplomatic tactic known as ancestral legitimation. By embedding present-day policy arguments, things like defense spending or the Atlantic Alliance, inside a really deep historical narrative, he made them feel not like partisan choices, but rather like undeniable obligations that just flow naturally from a shared civilization. It is an entirely different and, frankly, incredibly effective way to argue a point.
It really comes down to why a king can successfully say what an elected politician just can't. Think about it. An elected politician walks into that room carrying a ton of domestic baggage, party loyalty, and often relies on kind of an in-group versus out-group dynamic. But the monarch, he operates purely on lineage, inherited duty, and shared history. Plus, he uses what we call epistemic humility. He uses hedging language like I believe or perhaps. He isn't running for re-election, meaning he has absolutely zero domestic political skin in the game. So when he stands up and says we need to support our allies, half the room doesn't just immediately switch off.
Section 2, Diplomacy at the Dinner, Strategic Charm and Disarmament. Later that evening at the White House state dinner, the whole vibe shifted from a formal congressional address to much more interpersonal diplomacy. And this is where we see how carefully calculated humor was deployed to disarm some very strong personalities and expertly navigate that lingering geopolitical tension. Right off the bat, the tone was set perfectly. The king opened his remarks by thanking the U.S. for hosting him during the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of American independence, which, celebrating throwing the British out by honoring the British king is definitely a little ironic, right? But he leaned right into it, immediately following up with this totally disarming Oscar Wilde quote. We have really everything in common with America nowadays, except, of course, language. It was great. It instantly sparked laughter completely across the aisle. And the banter, it stayed incredibly sharp.
President Trump had actually made a controversial public comment a while back, stating that Europe would be speaking German right now if not for the United States. Well, in direct response to that, Charles delivered a perfectly timed retort. He just paused, looked out at the room, and said, "Dare I say that, if it wasn't for us, you'd be speaking French." It was such a bold, genuinely funny piece of pushback, and the entire room just ate it up.
But he didn't even stop there. He leaned even further into the tension. He said, "I cannot help noticing the readjustments to the East Wing, Mr. President. I'm sorry to say that we British, of course, made our own small attempt at real estate development of the White House in 1814. I mean, think about the sheer strategic bravery of that joke. He literally made a punchline out of British troops burning down the White House during the War of 1812. And guess what? It worked. It got a huge laugh out of the president. Absolute masterclass in reading the room.
Section 3, the perfectly calculated gift, HMS Trump. Because, as we know, diplomacy isn't only about words and speeches. It relies heavily on the physical symbols that get exchanged. And that brings us to what a lot of analysts are calling one of the most perfectly calculated diplomatic gifts in recent history. For his personal gift to the president, Charles brought over the original bell from the HMS Trump. This was a real British World War II submarine, launched from a UK shipyard back in 1944, that actually served and played a genuine role in the Pacific War effort.
Let's break down the calculus here, because it's just brilliant. Why was this such a masterstroke? First off, it obviously bears the president's name directly, but it's also an authentic World War II military artifact, which inherently ties the UK and the US together through shared wartime history. It has all this historical significance without feeling stuffy or overly formal. It perfectly appealed to the recipient's sensibilities. It's super personal, but it completely avoids feeling sycophantic. Whoever tracked down this specific bell knew exactly what they were doing.
Section 4, Modern Power, the tech dimension at Blair House. Because look, this visit wasn't just about honoring the past. It really showed that this 1,000-year-old institution is actively engaging with the future of global power. Before the state dinner even happened, the king held meetings at Blair House with some of the absolute biggest names in American tech. We're talking leadership from Amazon, NVIDIA, Apple, AMD, and Google. And instead of just exchanging basic pleasantries, they were actively diving into critical forward-looking topics, things like AI guardrails and startup funding. It's a crystal clear illustration of how modern soft power extends way beyond state dinners and right into the realms of artificial intelligence and the future of the global economy. Which brings us to Section 5, why soft power works, the deeper meaning. So the crucial point here is this. The monarchy was deployed to achieve something that elected officials simply couldn't pull off at that specific moment in time. And when you look at the tangible results, they're pretty undeniable. The king successfully carried the UK government's message, but he delivered it with a kind of warmth and authority that politicians just generally lack. He very deliberately invoked his mother's 1957 visit, which, remember, was also designed to repair strains after a Middle East crisis, and he just let that historical parallel speak entirely for itself. He navigated the massive shadow of the Iran controversy without directly mentioning it a single time. And perhaps most importantly, the very next day, it prompted President Trump to declare that the US has no closer friends than the British. So the king actually moved the needle on a severely strained relationship, and he did it using just one speech, a dinner, and a submarine bell. So I'll leave you with this final, ultimate question. Do soft power visits actually move the dial on real-world policy? Or is it all just theater once the motorcades leave town? It's definitely something fascinating to chew on when you're thinking about the true long-term value of diplomatic pageantry. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sheds some light on the brilliant behind-the-scenes mechanics of soft power. Catch you next time.